there's lots of people you can find employment with in this sector. Some of them are out there today. Broadly, I've put this out with private companies on the left-hand side, government agencies more or less down the middle-ish, and then the charity sector on the right-hand side, because that's three ways that you can sort of subdivide this sector up. So a different way to categorise careers in the sector would be as follows. So you could be focusing on surveying work. This is our ecologist Tony doing some plant surveys on a green roof in King's Cross, which is some of the work that we've done at London Wild Trust over the years, set up green roofs on top of offices, and we monitor and maintain them. Surveying and monitoring in the charity sector quite often is difficult to get into. So we've currently got, I think, 49 employees. We have one full-time ecologist who works in our charity arm. We have a couple who also work in our consultancy arm, but Tony is the only one. So if you're interested in doing surveying and monitoring work, the easiest area of the sector to break into would be the commercial consultancy end of it, because they every year will take on what are normally advertised as something like field ecologist positions, which are quite often hourly paid. It's not that great as a kind of job in and of itself, but it is a foot in the door, and if you can get yourself to be an ecologist with those companies, it's then a much more sort of straightforward thing after that. You could then potentially down the line switch from the private sector into the public or the charity sector from there once you've built up experience as a sort of field surveyor. I sort of outlined that here. You could sort of flip between the various strands of it, but the bulk of the jobs in terms of surveying and monitoring are in the private sector. Environmental education, I used to do this. I don't do it anymore. It wasn't really for me, but some people absolutely love this. Sharing their passion and knowledge of wildlife with young people. At London Wild Trust, we do a lot of sessions with primary age children, and that's quite common across the sector. Actually, that's an age group that's targeted quite a lot. And arguably, we should be doing more with secondary age across the sector as a whole. But quite often, you'll see jobs advertised that are sort of doing sessions for primary school visits to a nature reserve. Often, the teaching staff will still be there with the class, and you, as the session leader, are kind of delivering a kind of package to the primary school group to basically engage and infuse them with the wildlife on site. I've also put forest schools in here as well. That's a kind of growing movement that's kind of slightly standalone thing. We offer forest school sessions here, but you will often find, particularly private schools actually will employ their own forest school person. So if you want, and the reason that it's often private schools that do it because they've got more resource, but they also sometimes have big grounds of wherever their school is, where they actually can employ someone to kind of run a full-time forest school, and then different classes will go and see that member of staff throughout the week. This can be a really rewarding job, and so if you have a particular sort of ability to engage and enthuse children, and you're also passionate about the natural world, then this could be quite a good option for you. When I speak to children, I basically speak to them as I'm talking to you right now, and that doesn't keep them very engaged. So it wasn't really for me. I can't do basically, if you're very good at being enthusiastic about a snail, you'd probably be good at this, whereas I'm not demonstrative enough, I think, to kind of capture their attention, but everyone's different. And then practical work. So I won't go into kind of why we do management work on nature reserves. That's a whole other talk. But there is work to be done on nature reserves. This is me and a colleague on a brush cutter training course a few years ago. So you can get jobs with the charity sector, with local government, as I mentioned, and also with private companies who do contracting services. All three of these sectors employ people to do practical nature reserve work. This is quite often what people are interested in as a kind of antidote to, or alternative to, working in an office. It wasn't really the appeal for me necessarily. The appeal for me was because I'm interested in wildlife and sharing that with people and kind of making a difference for wildlife. But for some people, their main motivation is just to spend time outside, and therefore they're quite interested in this kind of job. I'll come back to motivations for doing different jobs a bit later. But yeah, you can get jobs working on nature reserves. You can get kind of like jobs that you might find satisfying enough in a kind of park setting. More and more parks are being managed with wildlife in mind, so a lot of like park ranger jobs are not just about jumping on a mower and cutting the grass anymore. There's a lot more kind of variety and interest to be had there as well. And in fact, parks and nature reserves are arguably coming closer together as a concept nowadays compared to what they were, I don't know, 40 years ago or something. And arboriculture, so tree care, is definitely a good career to consider. It's not just like rocking up and chopping down trees. If you haven't spoken to them already, we've got Down to Earth Trees here. You can talk to them about what they do as an organisation. It's much more like specialist and sort of an inspiring career than you might originally have thought. So yeah, do give that a thought as well. And in terms of management roles, you can end up doing something that I do now, where I don't actually do the practical work myself anymore. I just ask for it to be done, and people like Peter do it for me. Just, you know, there's pros and cons of that. I do miss the actual practical work, but if you go into a more management position, I guess you can have a bit of a bigger impact because you can see your influence and your work being played out on a wider scale rather than just on the project that you were working on if you were doing a practical role. So I miss being outside to the level that I used to be, but I get to have a kind of more of an overview of things that are going on. So yeah, pros and cons there. All right, I'm going to go. Does anyone have any questions on that first section? Or feel free to hold on to them to the end. Now I'm going to go through a few different interview questions. And basically these, different interviewers will do things differently. As an interviewer myself, what I tend to do is I have the ideal answer to the question already written down, usually in bullet points, and as the candidate says things that I was hoping they might say, I just cross them off, because it's faster for me to do that than to furiously write down everything they're saying. If they go off on a tangent about something that I haven't thought of and I think it's still a good answer, then I will obviously write that down. And I'll be like, okay, fair play, I never thought of that, but that is true. I will write that down. But generally speaking, I'm like just hoping they're going to, particularly in some of the questions I'm going to show you now, which have, there's only so much wiggle room in the answer. If you went on a really weird tangent, you would probably not be answering the question. So basically, these are my bullet point lists of the answers to my interview questions. So if you... yeah. So it's quite common in interviews to be asked about issues in nature conservation, but we're an urban nature conservation charity, and the issues in urban conservation are not necessarily the same as you might find other organisations around the country defining them. And this is not an exhaustive list, these are just some of my ideas, but these are some of the things that if you spoke about in an interview quite coherently and fluently, I as an interviewer would probably be fairly impressed with that. Dogs is an obvious one, I hope. For example, on this site we don't allow dogs on other than assistance dogs because of the disturbance to wildlife. But there are also some more minor things that you could talk about there with like dog fouling issues as well. If you don't have dogs on site, then you shouldn't theoretically have dog fouling issues either, which in some places like country parks on the urban fringe can be a massive problem for the staff who work there because it's just like a daily input of additional dog food. Fly tipping, as demonstrated in the picture here, is that's not a specifically urban issue, but it's something particularly in the kind of suburban areas where I would probably go as far as to say that this reserve doesn't have a problem with fly tipping because there's lots of people here, so fly tipping would be somewhat more difficult. But some of our nature reserves where the visitor numbers are much lower, we've had like industrial scale fly tipping incidents that we've had to deal with in the past. Vandalism, probably don't need to go into that. Fires, people buy those rubbish little like £2.50 barbecue things at Tesco and just like use them badly or leave them burning or whatever, and that can sometimes set fire to meadows. In a dry summer, you can set fire to a meadow, you can set fire to a heathland as well. You're going to struggle to set fire to like a deciduous woodland, and I sometimes have to be a bit careful when we get inquiries about a fire in a woodland that I'm not too flippant in my response. But it is quite difficult to set fire to a British woodlands because our native tree stock is not very flammable. But nonetheless, it's not something we actively encourage. Pressure from high visitor numbers, anyone who's worked on this site can attest to that as a difficulty. More and more people want to spend time in green spaces. London's population is going up. Green space provision is probably not keeping pace with the increase in London's population, combined with the increased interest in urban green spaces. So we have to always balance welcoming people into our nature reserves because we want to engage and enthuse the people of London with wildlife without inadvertently then damaging the wildlife that people are coming to see. And that's a difficult conversation to have because no one likes to be told that their visit is potentially problematic to the wildlife that they've come to see. This isn't always just about disturbing birds as it might be in the context of this site. In a lot of our sites, this will be to do with trampling and erosion and paths getting wider and wider and losing woodland wildflowers and things like that. So there's all of these things. If you can probably keep talking until the interviewer's like, yeah, thanks, that's enough. Understand that you get it. Site access constraints, that's sometimes a difficulty for us because some of our nature reserves are in locations that it's not maybe that easy to get machinery in if we need to do a large bit of repair work or management work. There's not a huge amount to say about that, but if you mention that, then that kind of indicates to an interviewer that you are thinking quite sort of logically and pragmatically about how to manage a nature reserve. And these last two are things that you could throw in that are slightly kind of broader topics, but urban heat islands, GCSE geography, do they still teach that maybe? Cities are warmer than the countryside, basically. I won't go into the details of why, but if you know about that, chat about that, because it does mean that the ecology of cities can be slightly different from the countryside because the average air temperature is a little bit higher. And pollution. Nowadays, we're mostly talking about traffic pollution in this country, particularly in London. A lot of heavy industry is nowhere near as active as it once was, traffic pollution is nitrate based, which is a sort of inadvertent fertilising effect. So if you talk about that kind of thing, then that kind of shows a broader understanding of issues at hand in urban nature conservation. All right, this is another question that I would say is usually answered horrifically badly because people, I think that it's like it's sort of a simple thing, and so people don't think about necessarily how to answer this question well, so they'll just say something like, oh, I'm very efficient and you can rely on me to always be like on time and stuff, and then just stop talking and you're like, is that it? kind of thing. So it's better to answer this question by giving some examples of why you're good at organising, or like the tools that you use to ensure that you are good at organising your time. And so, there are different ways of being good at organising your time, but you kind of need to justify a little bit to the interviewer why you believe you're good at it, because interviews are weird. I mean, like, you're asking someone a question and then they're going to just come back with, there's no like demonstrable evidence that this person is actually good at organising their time. You just have to kind of believe what they're saying. So like the more convincing answers tend to be ones that list a few examples of why someone is good at managing their time. So saying that you keep a to-do list, saying that you're good at managing your calendar. So for me, I like colleagues whose calendars are up to date, and if I look at their calendar I can reliably tell what they are up to and whether they might be available to meet with me or do something. And it's annoying if you have a colleague who doesn't do that properly. So I mean, at London Wildlife Trust and at many organisations, most colleagues who work together will share their calendars with each other, so that you can, if you need to book your colleagues in, you can work out when they're available without having to email or ring them or anything. Managing emails, I mean, I struggle with this because I get a lot of emails, but it is annoying to send emails to someone and never get replies, or get replies really infrequently. So having ways to keep on top of your inbox so that you aren't just allowing unread emails to accumulate like just massively. So the way I do it is that I file emails that I consider to be dealt with. So if I'm assuming that no one is expecting any further response from me on this email chain, I'll get rid of that email from my inbox, and anything that's sat in my inbox, I still have to do something with it, whether it's like file the attachment that someone sent me, or reply to it, or it's some other reminder for me to do something. I'll leave it in there, and if it's done, I'll take it out. And I think at the moment I've got about 75 in my inbox, which is not great, but it was running at about 500-600 a few weeks ago, so I had a big email cleanse and actioning and dealing with stuff in the last few weeks. But particularly as you get in small management positions, that can be difficult, because I just get copied into loads of emails. And they aren't necessarily addressed to me, but I kind of still feel the need to double check that I don't need to do anything with them before I get rid of them out of my inbox. But anyway, that's the way I do it. It's not necessarily the only way to do it. There are those flag and action things that you can use on Outlook. You can use different categories. There are different tools that you can use, but just have a think about that, because it's just a part of the modern way of working, even more so in the last 18 months, I would say. Being able to prioritise stuff is a good thing to talk about in this context, and I also put reprioritisation there, because sometimes, particularly when we're managing nature reserves, unexpected things happen, and the way I envision my week panning out might change because something happens. Like, for example, earlier this week, some cows escaped from one of our nature reserves, which obviously was not part of my plan for the week. I didn't actually have to deal with it particularly myself, because a local volunteer did, but at one point I was thinking I was going to have to cancel meetings and go and deal with that. So that can happen. And an important thing, if that kind of thing does happen, is then communicating to other people who might be involved in the plans that you did have, that you need to make changes. And that's where I guess good communication comes in. I would extend that to deadlines. It's annoying when a deadline's approaching and whoever was meant to do the piece of work on the day of the deadline lets you know that they haven't done it. It would be much better if 2 weeks before they'd said, I'm struggling to meet this deadline, can you help me, or can we change the deadline, or something like that. So it's much better to communicate even when things aren't going well, because it's better to do that than to just drop it on someone on the day that you thought something was due and they haven't done it. Flexibility. Many of our roles, like managing nature reserves in particular, you kind of need to be quite flexible and able to deal with a variety of situations. And I would say that's more like just a personality trait rather than being a jack of all trades necessarily. Just being willing to embrace the fact that different stuff happens, and maybe no day, it's a horrific cliche, but no day is the same kind of thing. And I put that in there because if you're too rigid of no, I plan my day to be like this, and your colleagues are well, we can never ask this person to help us with anything because they're too rigid. So there does need to be some level of flexibility in there. So I've just put all of these as ideas as just things that you can talk about that would demonstrate to an interviewer that you have a bit of a good understanding of time management, rather than just saying something like, yeah, you can rely on me kind of thing, and then just leaving it there. Flesh it out, and she's just left the room actually, Chantal was in here. This is Chantal leading a volunteer session. So this is a question that I might ask of someone who is applying to do a job that would involve leading practical conservation sessions. So the question would be phrased somewhat along the lines of talk me through how you would plan and deliver a successful volunteer session, something like that. Quite often what will happen when asked this question is people will jump in to this is in order, by the way. People will jump into this somewhere around here and then just go from there. And then at that point I might actually stop them and be like, hang on a second, how did you know what work you were going to do? How did the volunteers know where to go? All of this stuff. And I think the reason that happens is because many people's experience of volunteer sessions is as a volunteer. So you turn up to Peter's session he's already done all of the prep work, he's got the tools ready, he's decided what the task is for the day, he's emailed you to say where you're meeting, all of that stuff, and you've turned up and you've cracked on with the task. So in many people's minds, that is the session, but loads of stuff has already happened before that. So in an interview context, you need to, if you've done volunteering, you need to stop thinking of just the volunteer section and think of what happened before and what's going to happen after the session. And if you don't know what that is, then if you're on a volunteer session, just ask the person who's leading it, and they'll probably be happy to talk you through what they've done to prepare for that session and what they're going to do after it as well. So consulting a management plan and whatever work might have been undertaken towards that, the management plan objectives so far. But what I mean by that is we've got meadows that we cut here. Some of that's done already, some of them are still to do. So if Peter was on holiday for a few months and another colleague took over, they'd probably want to check with him, what's been done so far, kind of thing. Risk assessments, London Marsh Trust, we do this by activity. So if you were doing repairing some fencing, there is a risk assessment relating to that activity. But different organisations will do it differently. Some of them will do much more kind of site-based approach. So in an interview, there's not necessarily a right or wrong way to talk about that, but just reference the fact that you would risk assess the site and activity in question. Selection of appropriate tools and PPE. I love the fact that PPE since COVID is now just everyone knows what that stands for. I used to have to explain that, but you're getting your tools and your hard hats, your gloves, whatever, together. Generally speaking, the session leader will do that for the volunteers to some extent. There might be some degree of volunteers fetching their own tools, but I'd say in the majority of cases it will be done by the session leader. And then you've got to communicate the task to the volunteers and give them a safety briefing, which is sometimes known as a tools talk. And in reality, we all know that if you've got a team of very experienced volunteers who are safe using the tools that you're asking them to use, you're probably not going to patronise them every single time you see them and make them sit through a tools talk with you. I wouldn't say that in an interview though, unless you feel that that's like the vibe. Better to just stick to the I would give the tools talk and don't go down any road of but if they were experienced volunteers, I probably wouldn't bother. Yeah, I know you would do that, but don't tell me that in an interview. Because it just makes you sound a bit slapdash, basically. You want to monitor the volunteers throughout the session and make sure that they're having a good time. Potentially change the task that they're doing if you think it's getting a bit laborious and repetitive, and give them time for breaks, because you need to remember that volunteer sessions are not just about getting work done. In fact, probably more than the most important thing is that everyone is safe and well at the end of the session, and then the second most important thing is that they had a good time, and the third most important thing is that they did some work. The work is not the most important thing, and if you're prioritising that over people's enjoyment and people's well-being and safety, then you might want to reevaluate that to some extent. And then after the session, a member of staff or a lead volunteer will be recording what task was done and if there are any accidents or incidents on the session. So again, as a volunteer, you won't see that side of things necessarily, but that does happen after a session as well. I already gave a talk to some people on this subject earlier, but this is a similar kind of list to the previous one. This is a less common question. This is more commonly done at interviews, sometimes through the medium of a task. So they might say, "Could you lead us?" It won't be sprung on you. It might have been advertised as a second part of the interview is to do a little demonstration guided walk. I've seen that happen quite a few times. Yes, question at the back.
It was more to do with the sociological side of the experience as well.
Yeah.
Because I just wondered your route into it. My route was more I was more going out into the greens now and everything. And I had, as a sociology student, done some conservatory volunteering, and I realised that this is interesting for me. But I wondered how that really linked into the study of these societies, because you mentioned something about the urban spaces changing a bit more, where there's more influx of people coming into green spaces. So I just wondered how essentially how did you get into it? Was it as somebody who was people?
I might answer that question in a few slides' time, because I've got a slide a little bit about sort of journey through the first stages of conservation career. So if it's all right, I'll come back to that question then. Just quickly on guided walks then. You're going to choose a location for your site and potentially theme the walk. Is it a bird walk? Is it a tree walk? Is it like a seasonal thing, like spring walk or whatever? Consider the timing. If it's a bat walk, you want to look up the sunset times, for example. Think about your meeting point and your route. Make sure that the meeting point's easy to find, and that the route is like as easy to traverse through the site as possible. Not all nature reserves are fully accessible by their very nature. They're quite often quite steep and uneven paths and all that, but you can still try and take that into consideration. You want to advertise it, do your revision for the walk. I'll put this one in. This is shows that you're good at preparing a backup. Like if you bring along laminated pictures and maps and things, you might help you get around difficult weather that's stopping insects from being present, or just gives you something to talk about if there's a bit of a slow period of the walk. You check the site before just to check there's no fallen trees or some unexpected things like that. Donations tin, although we're actually now starting to use these contactless donation point things, which might get rolled out for guided walks as well. First aid kit and collect feedback. This is quite often needed for funding, so if a guided walk is being paid for by a particular funder, they will want some kind of evidence that the sessions were delivered and that hopefully people enjoyed themselves as well. So feedback can either be done in a paper form, or if you've got people's contact details because they've signed up via Eventbrite or something, then you can email them a survey form that way. If you're asked about a guided walk, then they're the kind of things that I would talk about probably. This one is something that I do a lot in my job, but a lot of volunteers will have no real way to access this as an area to get experience in. So it's absolutely fine in an interview to talk hypothetically if you haven't done something yourself. So they might ask you how do you deal with contractors working on nature reserves or whatever. It's perfectly fine to be honest and say, look, I haven't done that, but if I were to do it, this is how I would go about it. These are some of our graziers delivering cattle, by the way, on the right-hand side. You want to give them a clear specification of the work that you're asking them to do. You may meet with multiple contractors in order to do that, and different contractors may send you quotations or quotes for short, which is where they set out their understanding of the job and the price that they will charge for that. Then you're going to raise a purchase order for the contractor who you are appointing the job to. This might be very obvious to some people, but until I started, this was words that I've never heard until a few years ago, so that's why I put it in. The purchase order in many cases in this sector is the contract. We don't necessarily sign physical contracts with many contractors for small and medium-sized jobs. The purchase order is basically a promise to pay on behalf of your organisation if they deliver the work as set out in their quotation. To sort of summarise it basically. So for the contractor's perspective, receiving the purchase order is from their side of things, they know that they're going to get paid as long as they do what they said they were going to do. You want to agree the timing of the work with them, so some work might be sensitive to the bird breeding season, so you might want to sort of do that in the autumn and winter if the work in question is potentially damaging to bird breeding habitat. So you wouldn't be doing it in the spring and the summer, which is when birds are breeding. You'd need to work out the access arrangements with them if they're bringing big machinery on site. You need to make sure they've got keys, that they are happy that their vehicle can fit through whatever gates you've got. They might want to know about parking arrangements, things like that. Health and safety considerations. You will often hear this acronym used, RAMS, which stands for Risk Assessment and Method Statement. And people just bandy that thing around, have you sent your RAMS in yet? quite a common phrase to hear in this sector. The risk assessment is their assessment of the risk and what they're going to do to mitigate the risks associated with the job that they're doing. And the method statement is their description of how they're going to do the work. Particularly in the case of working near water courses, that will relate to how they're going to not pollute the water course, for example. So it's basically they're setting out how they're going to undertake the job in a safe and responsible manner in that whole document. You'd want to check the quality of their work. This really depends on your relationship with the contractor. I wouldn't go into this in an interview. I'd just say check the quality of their work by supervising them on site. But in reality, contractors that I trust, I'm quite happy for them to send me a picture on WhatsApp of the job being done. Contractors that I don't trust, I'll go and see them personally on site and check that they've actually done it. Being able to be in regular touch with them, because sometimes unexpected things happen while a contractor is doing a job, and if they're a good contractor, they will probably call you and run past you the options that they're now presented with by this unexpected thing, rather than just make a decision themselves and crack on. So, for example, I had a contractor a couple of years ago building a disabled access ramp at one of our nature reserves. Their excavator uncovered a load of buried sofas, which obviously we weren't expecting, to just sofas and mattresses just there, and he wanted to know what to do with them. And so this site is an old landfill site, I should qualify. So I said to him, it just doesn't matter, just rebury them, because that's just the nature of the site. But obviously he was pretty shocked to put his digger through and a sofa came out. And being a very responsible contractor, he rang me up and asked what I'd like to do. But if I hadn't picked up the phone, he would have been a bit I'm not really sure what to do. Or if I hadn't got back to him fairly quickly, I should say. And then this is a good one, consider how the completed work will actually integrate into the site's management. I've seen a few examples of this over the years where people have booked a large amount of contract work for no apparent reason other than the funding appeared to be available. So they're we've got £50,000 to do something, let's just do something, and they've just ordered some work to be done, and the contractor's probably done exactly what they were asked to do, but then it's turned out to be a complete waste of time because whatever it was that they did bore no relationship to the actual ongoing management of the site. So an example that I can think of is an area that was cleared alongside a riverbank, and should have been kind of followed up. The idea was to get more sunlight down onto the river to encourage fish to spawn and aquatic invertebrates to live there, but there wasn't actually enough resource to follow up that work, so it just happened, and then it now looks like exactly the same 3 years later. So sort of thinking about, if you've suddenly got a load of money to spend on something, how are you going to ensure that it's actually money well spent in the long run? This is quite a boring one, but you do need to talk about it. A lot of the work we do is funded by grants funding, and good grant funders want to know that their money's been spent responsibly, and therefore they need you to provide information in terms of recording, volunteer hours, feedback, etc. We also keep records of incidents and accidents, so if people aren't filling that out, then in my role as the health and safety lead for the organisation, I'll have no idea what's going on if people are not doing the kind of reporting of those incidents. And in terms of the management plan work on our nature reserves, if people are not recording the work that they've done, then again that makes it quite difficult, particularly at a slightly more management level, to have any idea what's going on, because I can't be everywhere at once, so I kind of need people to be fairly diligent with their recording and reporting. A good word to talk about here as well is impact. So this is a word that you'll often hear funders and trustees and various people who are kind of pushing charities to be better. They want to know how a charity is monitoring the impact of their work, and impact is basically for the input that the charity gets and sort of puts into its work, what outcomes are they actually getting that relate to their strategic goals. So is there any kind of measurable positive change towards the goals that the charity is set out to do? And good charities will be able to monitor their impact and decide and sort of can be judged on that, and some charities are really bad at it and have no real idea of the work that they're doing is having any positive impact at all. I think a lot of charities are getting better at it, we're getting better at it, it's a learning journey for a lot of charities as they sort of professionalise from into, I guess, organisations that will have the resource to monitor what they're doing. But yeah, that's something to talk about potentially if you get asked that. Quick one on identifying species. You may get asked to identify species in an interview. That might take the form of like a sheet of paper that gets pushed at you across the desk, and it has like some pictures on it, and they're like, "What are they?" Talk me through it. Or it might take the form of like some leaves that they push across the desk at you, or they might take you outside and ask you to identify a few different things or whatever. But the reason that they're doing that is because a lot of the work we do in any of the sectors that I talked about earlier kind of in a lot of like delivery roles does rely on a reasonable level of species identification. Obviously you can't be a professional in surveying and monitoring if you can't identify anything. Don't need to go into that. Education staff need to have some level of identification skills in order to pass that on to the people that they are hopefully engaging through their work. They don't need to be like national geniuses, but they need to be able to identify a reasonable selection of the species that are found on the nature reserves that they work on in order to do their job properly. And obviously our practical staff need to also be able to do that in order to correctly identify the habitats and the species that they're working on. So all of those sectors need some degree of skill in this area. And it's just a good skill to develop anyway. So these are my tips, really. This isn't an interview question as such. Like, you can't learn everything at once. I'm still learning. Everyone is really. Keep notes if you can. Because otherwise you'll learn something and then the thought will have gone a few weeks later. Ask for recommendations on good books and apps. Feel free to speak to me later about that if you want. This is the way I actually learnt most of what I know, is other people showing me. And for some reason, it might be the way my brain works, but that stuck with me a lot more. And like certain species, I can remember who originally showed it to me. And actually, it's quite a nice memory to have. Like, such and such colleague showed me that this is a scarlet elf cup fungus, and my nan showed me what a dunnock is and things like that. And actually a lot of these species the way my brain categorises stuff is like they're related to people that originally showed them to me. Test yourself when you're out and about, like literally just walking down the street. You can see if you can identify the street trees. Like, why not? You haven't got anything better to do, you're just walking somewhere. And teach friends and family. So it's quite a good way to also develop your confidence for guided walks, is to like try and convey the information that you already know to someone else, and it's also a good way to help that sink in. Sadly, the person who asked me that question, I know I see why she asked me that. She's now left, but anyway, I didn't quite get the context. So yeah, my own journey. I do have an ecology degree. I did various volunteering things for a while. I did an internship with London Wildlife Trust for a bit. My first job with London Wildlife Trust was, as I said earlier, education officer. It wasn't really for me, but I still quite enjoyed it. And then after that, I started working on a woodland project, where I was a project officer for a couple of years. And then a couple of years ago, I became nature reserves manager, so I was overseeing all of our nature reserves portfolio, which is kind of still my job, just my job title's changed in recent months. Slightly different, but basically the same. So I don't know if that's a particularly standard journey. I don't think there is a standard journey. I've been very lucky. I've had like opportunities come up. Arguably, like I've had a lot more opportunity than many other people have, and I recognise that. But you've also at the same time you've got to like be able to seize opportunities when they come. So. And I'd say the way I've been able to progress fairly quickly is by being willing to like do stuff above and beyond my job. And I don't mean like working myself into the ground, but just like, even being here today, I could have said no if I'd not turned up today. Nothing would have happened to me. No one would have disciplined me. But like by being like a good colleague and being helpful to everyone else, then you tend to build up a good reputation in the organisation, and that stands you in good stead. So that would be my tip in that respect. Here's some other tips though, in terms of interviews and just general stuff. So you are entitled to contact an organisation if you have any queries about a role that you're thinking of applying for. I would say though that there is a danger in this. If you ask a stupid question that is quite clearly written out in the job advert, that's not going to reflect well on you, because whoever the person who's going to have to answer that email will resent the fact that they're answering a question that's quite clearly answered in the job advert. So just be mindful of that. But you are still entitled to email in. And I'd say the classic one here is that quite often jobs advertised probably higher than the in terms of experience and all that than the employer is really expecting. So if you think you don't quite meet the criteria, it's maybe worth inquiring and just be honest and be like, look, I don't have, the degree that they're specifying, or they're specifying 5 years of experience, but you've only got 2. Just be like, look, I'm really interested in this role, I think I'd be a good fit, but I don't actually have the level of experience you're stipulating. Would it still be worth me applying? And I'd say more often than not, they'll come back and say, yes, please apply anyway. Yes.
Can I quickly add to that, which may be useful? I've just been to a CVP workshop.
Yeah.
And my advisor told me something I never even thought of, is that I thought also that you have to be like actually 100% all the requirements. But she said 60%, if you see you matching 60%, send the application.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, gosh, this is amazing.
Yeah, I mean, I would completely agree with that, because that's how people progress. Like, otherwise, everyone will be stuck at their level of organisations forever. Like, the way that people progress in their career is by applying for stuff that they maybe don't have everything that's there. But and it is just a common thing that employers do. That they'll put out a series of things that they're expecting from the ideal candidate, but that doesn't mean that they can't give you the job. And it also doesn't mean that you can't outperform someone who does meet those criteria in an interview. I would definitely say that's a good thing to do. But if you're thinking, am I wasting my time here, you can just email and double check with them, and that's a completely acceptable thing to do. But don't ask them a stupid question. If you've been unsuccessful, you can ask for feedback, although I would caveat that with quite often people genuinely don't have time to give you feedback, and that used to annoy me when I was younger. I was like, why can't they give me feedback? But now, when I'm on the recruiting side of things, I mean, for some jobs we have had one job that I was on the interview panel for, we had 430 applicants, so I literally don't have time to give those people feedback. So in reality, now what I do is, if someone got an interview and was unsuccessful, I will give them feedback, but I generally, if it's someone who we didn't offer an interview to, I won't do it, because I could potentially be there for weeks, writing feedback on people's application forms when I've already spent quite a lot of time going through them in the first place. So don't be too upset if they don't give you feedback, but it's always worth asking, and you never know, they might. The context in which they're most likely to give you feedback is if they thought you were really good, but there was just another candidate who was slightly better, and they'll be wanting to speak to you anyway to be like, look, you are great, you just came up against a good candidate. These are the things you could have done slightly better, and we hope to receive an application from you in the future, or something like that. Find a mentor. This could be someone that you volunteer with, or just a friend, or there are also official conservation mentoring schemes out there. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what someone might know in the room actually. If you Google conservation mentoring, there is an actual scheme where they will link you up with a conservation professional who just, I don't think you ever meet them, you can just exchange emails with them and stuff. Or maybe they have their own messenger thing. I'm not sure. I didn't do it myself, but you can do that informally or formally. And then once you've made it in your career, then be that mentor to someone else. It's actually quite satisfying watching people that you've had a little bit of input into their career going on and being successful. So I'd definitely try and do that if you can. This is quite a big one for me. Take opportunities even if you think they're not exactly what you want to do. When I've been trying to help people in their careers, I found it quite frustrating when they keep saying to me oh no, I'm waiting for the perfect job. And I'm like, what? You're 22 and you've got no experience. You might be waiting for years. Just take a job. You can always apply for another one. I do think sometimes that's like a confidence thing where people might actually be saying that as an excuse to not apply for stuff that they think they're going to get rejected for. And I understand there's like a whole potentially other thing going on there, but nonetheless, as a general rule, don't rule yourself out of jobs. Like, even if you think this is like maybe an interesting job, but you're not 100% sure, then like you might as well apply for it anyway, unless you're really strapped for time in terms of applying for loads of jobs, you know, within reason. But I would say don't take yourself out of the running for stuff unless there's a particularly good reason to. That can link onto this point below about reshaping your current role to develop in areas that you want to get better at. Again, that's within reason. But if you take a job as an education officer and you spend very little of your time delivering education sessions, that's probably not going to go down well with your manager. But if you are good at your sort of baseline job and you're showing interest in other things and your manager is like pleased with your performance in like what the basics of what they're expecting you to do, they might be accommodating to helping you explore like other things that you're interested in developing. Certainly that's what I do with people in my team. As long as they're not like completely useless, I'll like, you know, allow them to explore other things that they're interested in. So that's not licensed to just like do whatever you want in a job. Like, be good at your job, and then as an extension, like tell your manager what you're interested in getting better at. Jen, oh, okay. And travel or temporary location. I know this isn't an option for everyone, depending on your life circumstances, but if it is an option for you, then, you know, do consider like going somewhere else for a bit. A lot of conservation jobs can be short contracts, so if there's like a summer job as a warden somewhere really random, and you're able to get that job, then why not? Like, just go and see somewhere else for a few months. You know, don't just confine yourself to London, basically, is what I'm saying. I did a summer as a warden in Berkshire. In fact, actually, I commuted there I was working for London Wildlife Trust at the time, and I was working on the weekends for the Berkshire, Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire Wildlife Trust, so I would just go there and I would stay overnight in a B&B, and then I'd come back the next day, and I made actually pretty much no money because I spent it all on the train tickets in the B&B, but it was like good paid experience on my CV, and I absolutely loved the job, and it was just a short contract of 5 months. And I think it helped me to get future jobs because it was, at the time I was doing the education work, and this was like a practical ranger job I was doing on the side. And then finally, be proud and don't let an organisation take advantage of you. What I mean by that is that in this sector you will find people who promise you jobs around the corner, and they may not be doing it maliciously. They might genuinely think you're great and want to give you an opportunity, and they might be working on some kind of funding bid that they think, like there's money around the corner kind of thing, and we could employ this volunteer who's great. But basically, you don't really owe them enough to like turn down other opportunities to wait for their like mythical opportunity, because it may never appear. So they're not going to think badly of you if you go and get a job somewhere else. You can always come back to that organisation. But I've known a few people who've like hung around on the promise of a job that never materialised, and like didn't take other opportunities because of that. And I think that was a shame. So yeah, like not many people are going to do that to you deliberately to like sabotage your career, but they might be doing it to you accidentally. So just be mindful of that. Little shout out to the Keeping It Wild traineeships. So we have a traineeship scheme at London Wildlife Trust. Some of our former trainees are in the room today. And in fact, some of our former trainees are also on our books as staff now. Bobby, who's here, used to be one of our trainees, and Chantal, who was in the room briefly earlier, also. So yeah, this is like a kind of opportunity for people aged 16 to 25 to kind of explore the sector through a paid traineeship and get a kind of range of skills and experiences that will then allow them to not only access jobs but also potentially shape a little bit during that time what they want to do. Probably a lot of the trainees might say that they're still working out what they want to do. That's fine, but it at least like gives you a kind of taster of what we do in this sector and can help kind of develop in that respect. So we've recently been successful in getting a new round of funding for this, so which is great news. So there are more traineeships coming up. Dates are here. So yeah, applications starting next month. So have a look on our website for details of that. I didn't make the slides very nice. But yes, Omar, Jess and Charlie are all in the room actually. If you want to chat to them about what their experience of being a trainee with us was like, and you know about the top bit, the CV and cover letter workshops. And I think that is it. Yes. Great. Thank you all for coming. I think I've basically run out of time, but I could take maybe one quick question if anyone's got something they'd particularly like to ask.
How strict are these 16 to 25 rules? That's strange.
I think we have to be very strict because it's like that's what the funder is paying for, basically. Yeah.
Because not being kind to do 25 and stuff.
Yeah.
To be fair, I think I was like a bit over the age when I started because I applied when I was still 25.
Oh, okay. So there's a grey area there. Yeah.
It's more rare.
Okay, great. Well, if anyone wants to just chat to me like one-to-one, then I'll just be like here for a bit. So thanks to everyone for coming, and thanks for coming to the event in general. Yeah.